It was late September 2018 when my boss, Darren, invited me on a camping trip in the hills near Keswick, in the northern part of England's Lake District. I was 29 then, working a construction job in Carlisle. Darren was in his mid-40s, always calm, always in charge. We didn't have a close relationship, but I respected him. He was the kind of boss who'd lend a hand lifting lumber or work late without complaining. So when he asked if I wanted to get away for a few days and do some wild camping before the season turned too cold, I agreed. I didn't have plans anyway. He picked me up in his old silver Hilux on a Thursday morning. We'd already packed the gear 2 nights before: 2 tents, a few fishing rods, portable stove, dried food, and plenty of beer. He said we'd hike off trail and find a quiet place away from tourists. That suited me just fine. I liked solitude, especially somewhere far from the noise of Carlisle. I didn't ask too many questions. I figured Darren had done this before. The drive was quiet. Gray skies hung above us the entire time, and a steady drizzle smeared across the windshield. By the time we reached a narrow, crumbling lane that led into the deeper hills, it was already midday. The air had that damp, earthy smell, like wet stone and soil. Darren parked the truck behind a stone wall covered in moss, killed the engine, and pointed to the woods. We'd walk from there. We trekked for over 2 hours. The terrain was steep in parts, muddy, and uneven. Tree roots twisted across the path, and thick bracken clung to our clothes. We passed a few old sheep pens and broken fences, but there was no sign of people. I remember how strangely quiet it was. Not even birdsong most of the time, just the sound of our boots sucking through wet ground and the rustle of our packs. Eventually, we found a flat spot near a small tarn, surrounded by low hills and a mix of pine and ash trees. The ground was soft but not boggy. It looked like no one had camped there in years. It was peaceful in a way, but something about the area made me uneasy. Not in a supernatural way, just a gut feeling. Couldn't place it. We pitched the tents about 15 meters apart. Darren's was on the side closest to the trees. Mine was a bit nearer to the water. We built a small fire ring with stones and set up our gear. I started boiling water while he opened a couple of cans and handed me one. The rain came and went, light but persistent, soaking everything slowly. We ate in silence and drank until the sky went dark. That first night, I couldn't sleep. The tent felt colder than I expected. The wind picked up around midnight, rushing through the trees like a wave. At one point, I thought I heard movement like branches snapping, but I chalked it up to deer or the weather. I didn't bother Darren. He was probably out cold. I lay awake for hours, staring at the roof of the tent, listening. The next morning, I found Darren already up, walking along the edge of the tarn with a rod in his hand. He looked tired, eyes darker than the day before. He said he hadn't slept well either. That made me feel a little better. We fished for an hour and caught nothing. The water was still and dark. The air felt heavier than before, like something was coming. That afternoon, we decided to hike a bit farther into the hills. Darren said he remembered seeing a bothy years ago, one of those old stone huts left behind by shepherds. Maybe it was still standing, maybe not, but he wanted to check. I followed without thinking too much of it. We took only one pack between us, some water, food, and a map. We walked for about an hour, then another. There was no sign of any bothy. The higher we went, the worse the weather got. Rain came harder, and mist started rolling in from the west. The path disappeared completely, and we had to guess our way across heather and wet rock. Darren was quiet the whole time, eyes fixed ahead like he was chasing something he couldn't quite see. At one point, we found what looked like an old stone wall, mostly collapsed and buried in growth. There were bits of rusted fencing and rotting wood nearby. Darren said it wasn't the bothy, but maybe part of an old farmstead. We took shelter there for a while, eating crackers under the dripping branches of a twisted tree. The wind picked up again, colder than before. I kept glancing over my shoulder, not because I heard anything, but because I couldn't shake the feeling we weren't alone. We eventually turned back, but the rain made it hard to find our way. The fog was thicker now, and everything looked different. We didn't speak. Darren moved quicker, less careful. I slipped once on wet stone and bruised my elbow. When we finally reached the camp again, it was nearly dusk, and something was wrong. Darren's tent was collapsed. Mine was still standing, but the flap had come unzipped and was flapping in the wind. I walked over fast and checked inside. Nothing was missing, but everything was wet. I looked at Darren, expecting him to say something, but he just stood there, staring at his tent like he didn't recognize it. I asked him what he thought happened. He didn't answer. Instead, he walked into the trees behind the fire pit and disappeared. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. I called out once, but got nothing back. The wind swallowed everything. I waited longer, pacing. I didn't go after him, not yet. I kept expecting him to come out on his own, but he didn't. Eventually, I grabbed a torch and followed where he'd gone. The ground was uneven, thick with dead leaves and wet branches. I walked for 20, maybe 30 minutes, calling his name into the gray. No response. I never saw a trail, no fresh footprints, just the quiet pressing in around me. I turned back before it got too dark. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the damp tent, listening. Rain tapped on the roof. I kept the torch close and the zip halfway open. Around 3 a.m., I thought I heard something again. Not branches breaking this time, breathing. Not mine. Slow, shallow. It came from outside the tent, maybe a meter away. I held my breath. It didn't move, didn't fade. It stayed for almost a minute before I heard the crunch of footsteps slowly heading off toward the trees. I stayed frozen until first light. When morning came, I packed up fast. Darren was still gone. I left his tent as it was and carried what I could. The hike back to the truck felt longer, harder. I looked over my shoulder every few minutes, thinking I might see him or someone else following. But I didn't. When I reached the Hilux, I waited inside for an hour, hoping maybe he'd show up. He didn't. I started the engine and drove down the lane in silence. I reported him missing later that day, told the police everything I knew. They searched for days. Helicopters, dogs, volunteers. Nothing turned up. Not a shoe, not a scrap of clothing. They questioned me a few times, but I didn't have anything else to give them. I kept thinking maybe he'd just walked off and didn't want to come back. But that didn't feel right. A few weeks later, they found the remains of a campsite in the hills north of where we were. No body, no ID, just another collapsed tent, some old gear, and a pile of rocks stacked in a strange pattern. They didn't say if it was connected, but I saw the photo online, and it made my skin crawl. It looked almost exactly like the spot Darren had led us to, just older. I never heard from him again. Never went camping again either. Sometimes I think about that trip. Not the rain, not the cold, but that sound outside my tent. That slow, steady breathing. I know it wasn't the wind. I know what I heard. And the worst part is, I think Darren heard it too the night before he vanished. My name's Adam. I was 33 when this happened, and it's one of those things I've never been able to talk about without my hands shaking. It happened in the summer of 2018, mid-July, during one of those unusually dry heat waves we were getting across the UK. I'd been dealing with a lot back then. Too much work, a breakup that just left me feeling like a hollow shell, and this constant feeling that my life had plateaued. I'd been craving solitude, not in the poetic sense, but just the urge to be somewhere quiet, somewhere without people, screens, or clocks ticking at me. So I took a week off work, packed up my gear, and drove out from Birmingham into rural Wales. I'd done a bit of wild camping in the past, Scotland mostly, but never Wales. I wanted something remote but not too far off from reality, in case something went wrong. I started looking at old maps and satellite views and found this spot near an old abandoned quarry outside a place called Langinog. It was one of those deep stone pits surrounded by woodland, with no real footpaths nearby. Perfect. The quarry itself was long defunct. I couldn't find much history on it, just that it had shut down sometime in the late 80s and had since overgrown. The closest village was about 6 miles out, and the only access was by an old forestry trail that had been taken over by grass and bramble. I figured I could hike in, set up camp in the woods near the edge of the quarry, and just spend a few nights in peace. I parked my car down a hidden gravel pull-off, walked about an hour through overgrowth and woodland, then came to the top ridge that overlooked the quarry. It was deeper than I expected, probably 70 or 80 feet down to the bottom. One side was almost vertical slate rock, the other sides covered in trees and thick underbrush. There was still water pooled at the bottom, dark and greenish, with half-submerged rusted debris scattered in it. Nearby was a clearing flat enough for a tent, nestled between young trees. That's where I pitched camp. The first night was uneventful. I cooked up a meal on my portable stove, drank a beer I'd packed, and lay on my sleeping mat listening to the insects buzzing in the trees. The air smelled of pine and dry moss. Occasionally, I'd hear small rocks tumble down the quarry walls, probably from rabbits or deer. I was still wired from the drive and the hike, so I didn't fall asleep until after midnight. But on the second day, things began to shift in a way I didn't fully register at the time. I woke up to find faint boot prints about 10 feet from my tent. That might not sound strange, hikers, hunters, maybe even other campers, but these prints hadn't been there the night before. I was sure of it. The ground was dry, but there'd been morning dew, and I could see the fresh indentations in the patchy moss. The shape wasn't hiking boots either. It looked more like steel-toe work boots, wider, more squared off. And there were no tracks leading in or out, just a cluster of them facing toward the tent. Then nothing. I crouched there staring at the prints for a long time, trying to rationalize it. Maybe I hadn't seen them last night. Maybe someone had been out here years ago and the ground just hadn't recovered. But I couldn't make it add up. The moss was soft, and the indentations were fresh. Still, I shrugged it off. I was tired. Maybe it was nothing. That afternoon, I took a walk along the outer edge of the quarry. I didn't go down into it. There was no path, and the steep drops didn't look safe. But I followed the tree line, trying to get a full loop. On the far side, I came across something odd. It was a tarp, faded blue, cracked in places, half buried under branches. I pulled it back and found a collapsed tent beneath it. The thing was sun-bleached and crusted in dirt, like it had been there for months. Inside were 2 crushed cans of beans, a melted plastic spoon, and a water bottle filled with yellowing fluid. A wool sock was caught in one corner.
No sleeping bag, no gear.
It looked like someone had just stopped mid-use and left it all to rot. I should have left then. Looking back, that was the moment. I should have packed up and walked out. But I convinced myself it was just some homeless guy or a traveler who gave up and walked off. I wasn't afraid yet. I just felt uneasy. That night, I heard what I thought was someone whistling. Came from somewhere down near the quarry, faint and broken. Not a tune, but more like someone trying to mimic a bird and getting it wrong. It happened just once. I sat up in my tent, ears straining. Nothing followed, just the regular chirp of insects. I didn't sleep much. The third day was hot. The air felt heavier, like a storm might be coming. I didn't do much, just stayed around the tent, read a bit, and tried not to overthink the weirdness. But that evening, something changed in the way the woods felt. It's hard to explain. The trees were the same. The light was the same. But the woods felt watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder. I couldn't shake the sense that something was standing just out of sight. Around dusk, I walked to the quarry edge to look at the view. That's when I noticed something that froze my blood. Across the quarry, maybe 50 meters away, near where I'd seen the old collapsed tent, a figure was standing among the trees. Just standing there, not walking, not doing anything. I couldn't make out any details, just a human shape. Stocky, still. I blinked and stared for what felt like minutes. But when I looked away to rub my eyes and looked back, he was gone. I didn't hear any footsteps, didn't see him walk off, just gone, like a blink. I backed off from the quarry edge and returned to camp quickly. That night, I didn't cook. I didn't turn on my flashlight. I just lay in the tent in the dark, gripping my knife, every sense stretched to breaking. At one point, I swear I heard something brushing against the fabric of my tent. Just once, a slow drag, then nothing. I waited until dawn and packed up the second the light changed the sky. I didn't care how tired I was. I stuffed everything into my bag. Didn't even bother rolling my sleeping bag properly. I just needed to get out. But when I got to the trail I'd used to hike in, something was wrong. The path had been disturbed. Small branches snapped, scuff marks in the dirt, like someone had walked along it recently. At one point, I saw a clear boot print, that same square shape. I started walking fast, didn't stop for water, didn't stop to rest, just kept moving, heart thudding. The trees felt too quiet.
No birds, no breeze.
Just my own breath and the crunch of my boots. Then, about 20 minutes from where I'd parked, I found something that made my stomach turn. A dead rabbit hanging from a low branch by its hind legs. Its throat had been cut, blood dried and blackened. It was tied with a thin green cord, purposefully, deliberately. I didn't stop. I didn't even look back. I ran the last stretch. When I got back to my car, everything looked normal. No flat tires, nothing broken, but there was something wedged under the windshield wiper. A strip of paper. It was blank, just a strip of white printer paper, creased, slightly damp. No writing,
No symbols.
just left there. I drove away without looking in the mirror once. Didn't stop until I hit the main road and saw proper houses. I've never returned to that part of Wales. I deleted the old maps I used, threw out the tent and all the gear I used on that trip. And for a long time, I couldn't sleep unless all the lights were on. I never figured out who that man was, or what he was doing out there, or why he watched me. Maybe he was living out in those woods. Maybe he was just a sick person who liked to mess with people. But I don't think it was random. I think he knew I was coming. I think he watched me walk in and decided not to stop me. The scariest part isn't what he did. It's what he didn't do. He never touched my stuff. He never confronted me. He never even said a word. He just watched and let me know he was there. I was 34 when I decided to take that solo camping trip out in central Utah. It was late September 2018. The weather was cooling just enough to keep the bugs away, but still warm in the afternoons, the kind of time you could hike for hours without sweating through your clothes. I'd driven past Sevier Lake a few years back during a road trip and never forgot how strange it looked. An empty, cracked lakebed stretching for miles, almost alien. I had it in the back of my mind ever since. So, when I had a 4-day break from work and needed to clear my head, I loaded up my gear and drove west out of Nephi with no real plan besides getting out there and being alone. There's not much out that way. Once you get off Highway 50, you're in a patchwork of forgotten roads, old ranch fencing, dry hills, and cheatgrass. No stores, no gas, no people. I liked that. I drove a few miles south of the main road and found a spot maybe a mile and a half from the edge of the old lakebed, right where the rocky hills started to roll up into bigger terrain. The ground was dry and solid enough to park the truck off the track. I pitched my tent in the shadow of a low hill, maybe 100 yards from where the dirt opened into that wide, pale expanse of lake bed. The air smelled like dust and sun-baked plants. The first night was quiet. A few crickets, some kind of owl off in the distance. Nothing strange. I read a bit by headlamp, ate a cold meal, and climbed into my sleeping bag. I didn't even build a fire. It was too dry and windy, but I wasn't out there for campfires. I just wanted peace. It was sometime past midnight when I woke up to a dull thump outside. Not loud, just enough to snap me out of that weird, half-awake state. I froze, listening. My first thought was maybe the wind shifted something, maybe my camping chair or the tailgate of the truck. I waited, breathing slow, trying to hear something else, but it was dead still. No wind, no insects now either, just silence. After a few minutes, I talked myself out of being nervous. Probably nothing, just nerves from sleeping alone way out there. I zipped my bag back up and went back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped out and noticed my folding chair had been knocked over. The odd thing was that it wasn't where I'd left it. I had set it by the truck, but now it was about 10 feet away, lying on its back like it had been dropped there. I looked around and didn't see any fresh tracks or signs of animals. The ground was hard-packed, but still, you'd think if a deer or something large had brushed it, you'd see something. I felt a little off, but not enough to leave. I had planned to stay at least 2 nights. That afternoon, I hiked out toward the lake bed. There's something unsettling about standing on something that used to be full of water but now stretches out cracked and flat in every direction. I walked nearly a mile out, boots crunching the brittle surface under me. I found what looked like animal bones near the middle, sun-bleached and scattered, probably a dead cow or something from years ago. But the weirdest thing was a single plastic milk crate with a rock on top of it. No tracks around it, no path leading to it. Just sitting there in the middle of nowhere. Stuck in my head the rest of the day. That milk crate. Who would bother dragging that way out there? And why? When I got back to camp, it was nearing dusk. The wind had started to pick up again, whistling through the brush. I boiled some water and made a pouch meal, trying not to think about the chair or the crate. I didn't hear anything strange that second night, but I still didn't sleep much. I kept waking up in a cold sweat. No dreams, just that weird feeling in my gut like I was being watched. My tent was zipped. My stuff was where I left it. Nothing technically wrong, but I felt it. That edge of your vision feeling, like when you know someone's staring but you don't see them. I woke up just before sunrise, needing to piss, so I stepped outside the tent. That's when I saw the footprints. Dozens of them. Bare feet, not animal tracks. Human, small too, like someone with narrow feet, walking slowly in erratic lines all around my tent, circling, stopping, stepping back, then forward again. Some were only partial, just toes or the ball of the foot. The rest faded into the rocks and dirt a few yards out. They weren't there the night before. I would have seen them. They were fresh. My stomach turned over. I scanned the hills, the brush, the lake bed. Nothing. But I didn't feel alone. I didn't pack up right away. I should have. But I felt like if I acted too quickly, if I rushed, something worse would happen. So I moved slow. I made coffee, packed one bag at a time, looked over my shoulder every minute or so. The prints had no shoes, no obvious direction. Whoever left them didn't come in from one path and leave by another. They wandered in circles. By 9 a.m., I had the tent packed, gear stowed, truck loaded. Before I left, I took a quick walk up the small hill near where I'd camped. I hadn't checked it the whole trip. It was only 50 feet up. From the top, you could see the lake bed, my campsite, and the wide flatlands to the north. I saw something I hadn't noticed before. A small black spot maybe 200 yards further out toward the hills. I squinted. It didn't look natural. More like an old shack or shed. Just a square box. I hadn't seen it driving in. It was half sunken and hidden from most angles. Curiosity pulled at me hard, but I also knew better. That place wasn't on a map. There were no signs, no trails leading to it. I told myself I'd just drive close enough to get a better look. I drove in a wide arc, keeping distance until I came up parallel with it. It was worse than I expected. It wasn't a shack. It was a makeshift shelter made from scraps of wood, corrugated metal, tarps, and bits of fencing. Somebody had built it over years. The door was a hanging piece of carpet, stained and torn.
No windows.
The ground around it was littered with junk. Plastic bottles, food wrappers, rusted cans, old tools, wire, and shoes. Dozens of shoes, all different sizes, half buried in dust. Most of them looked like they hadn't moved in years. I didn't go in. I didn't even get out of the truck. I sat there with the engine running, staring, heart pounding. There was no sign of anyone, but that was the worst part. It meant whoever built it was probably out there right then, somewhere in those hills watching me. I turned around and drove out without stopping again. I didn't eat until I was almost back in Nephi, and I didn't sleep properly for 2 nights after that. Even when I was back in my apartment, with the door locked and the blinds shut, I couldn't shake the feeling. The way those prints circled the tent, the crate in the lake bed, the shelter full of trash and shoes. Somebody had been living out there, probably for years, maybe decades, off-grid, unseen. And for some reason, they didn't like me being near. I never reported it. I don't know why. Maybe I was afraid someone would think I was lying. Maybe I was afraid someone else already knew and didn't care. All I know is I'll never camp alone again, especially not in Utah, especially not near a dry lake bed where someone might be watching from the hills. It was the fall of 2016 when I decided to go on a solo camping trip in Wales, somewhere in the Berwin Mountains. I was 32 back then, working in a dull job in an office outside Birmingham. I had grown tired of the same routine, commuting, working, sleeping, and I wanted to get out, breathe fresh air, and remind myself of how quiet the world could be when you got away from people. I used to hike and camp a lot when I was younger, so I felt like I needed that again. I wanted to disappear for a weekend, far from anything familiar, and just sit in the rain if I had to. The forecast said light showers, but I wasn't too bothered. I liked the sound of rain on the tent. I packed my gear into the back of my old Volvo. Nothing fancy, just the basics. A waterproof tent, a sleeping bag, some food, a portable stove, extra socks, a decent knife, and an old torch that had never failed me. I drove west and got there by early afternoon. There was no one around for miles, no signal on my phone either, which was exactly what I wanted. I found a flat clearing between 2 rises, not far from a narrow forest trail that looked like it hadn't seen much use in years. It was just grass and moss around me, with thick trees on one side and a slope leading down to a small stream on the other. I pitched my tent and boiled some water for tea. The clouds were heavy already, a gray sheet across the sky, and the air had that sharp, damp smell that always comes before real rain. By dusk, the wind picked up and the rain started. It came steady at first, and I sat inside the tent reading an old paperback by headlamp, listening to the soft patter above me. Hours passed like that. I ate a quick dinner from a tin and zipped myself into the sleeping bag. The tent shook a little with the wind, but it was holding firm. I lay there, drifting off, the sound of the rain growing heavier. Somewhere around midnight, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. The rain was louder now, hammering the sides of the tent, and the wind had turned aggressive, pulling at the guy lines. But it wasn't that pulled me from sleep. It was something else. A noise, a slow, crunching sound, like footsteps on wet grass. I froze. It was hard to tell with the rain beating everything, but I was almost certain I had heard something just outside. I reached for my torch quietly and clicked it on. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't move much at all. I just lay there, breathing shallow, trying to listen past the storm. The sound didn't come again. Eventually, I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe, or just the wind pushing a branch along the ground. I forced myself to relax and closed my eyes again, but I didn't sleep well after that. The wind got worse and the rain kept pounding. I must have drifted off again, though, because the next time I opened my eyes, it was early morning. The inside of the tent was still dry, but everything outside was soaked. I unzipped the flap and looked out. It was foggy and cold. My boots were damp inside, but I slipped them on and stepped out to stretch my legs. That's when I noticed the marks. Just a few feet away from the tent, there were footprints in the soft, wet grass. Not deep, but clear. They weren't mine. I had set up my tent and walked around it only on the first day, and I was careful with how I moved. These were fresh. They came from the woods, stopped near my tent, and then disappeared back toward the trees. They didn't look like boots, more like trainers, and they were close together, as if whoever made them was standing still for a while, just watching. My stomach turned cold. I stood there staring at them for a long time, not sure what to think. It was early morning. Mist was rolling in from the trees, and the air felt heavy. I followed the tracks as far as I could, but they faded out in the moss just before the forest began. There were no broken branches, no other signs, just that someone had come out during the storm, walked right up to my tent, and then walked away. I spent the rest of the morning on edge. I kept checking my surroundings. I even moved the tent a bit closer to the stream where I could see further in every direction, but I didn't pack up. I thought maybe it had been a lost hiker or someone drunk, wandering, but the longer I thought about it, the more it bothered me. It didn't make sense. Who would be up there, in the middle of nowhere, during a storm, walking quietly through mud and rain just to stop beside a stranger's tent? That evening, the rain returned. I didn't sleep much. I kept the torch close and the knife even closer. Every time the tent flapped in the wind, I jolted awake. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. Crunch. Soft, slow steps. This time, I didn't turn the light on. I just lay there, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The steps circled the tent once. I swear it took almost a full minute. Then silence. No retreating steps. No sound of the trees. Nothing but rain. I waited until dawn. When I stepped outside, the prints were there again. This time closer, right up against the tent wall where my head had been. I hadn't imagined it. I packed everything in 15 minutes. I didn't eat. I didn't speak. I didn't look back. I hiked straight back to the road, boots squelching in the mud. I got to the car and drove without stopping until I hit the motorway. Later that week, when I told a coworker what happened, he shrugged and said maybe it was a poacher or some old farmer. But something about it didn't feel like that. It wasn't just the footprints. It was the way they moved, how close they came, and the fact they didn't leave after the first night. They came back, and they didn't knock or yell or ask for help. They just stood there, in the rain, watching. I never camped alone again after that. And even now, when it rains at night and I'm lying in bed, sometimes I think I hear it again. Soft steps outside the window, just out of view, waiting. It was October 2009 when I decided to take a solo hunting trip out to western Montana. I was 32 then, working construction jobs off and on around the state, and things had slowed down that fall. I figured I'd take advantage of the downtime before the snow really started to fall and head into the mountains for a week or so. I'd been out in that area before, near a place called Elkhorn Ridge, but not deep. This time, I wanted to go way out, off the forest roads and past the old timber lines, where the game still moved like it did decades ago. I parked my truck about 6 miles off a gravel Forest Service road, near a dried creek bed that was just barely marked on my map. From there, I hiked in another few miles, dragging a sled behind me with my rifle, tent, food, stove, and everything else I'd need. The area I chose wasn't marked, but I had done enough scouting on topographic maps and aerial shots to know it would be secluded. It was deep forest, mostly lodgepole pine with some heavy underbrush in spots and a few rock outcrops further up the ridge. By the second day, I had set up a decent camp. I found a flat spot between two thick trees and cleared a space for my tent. I strung up a tarp in case of rain and set up a small fire pit using rocks I gathered nearby. I boiled water from a small spring trickling downhill and stored my food in a dry bag hanging up a tree. Hunting was slow. I spotted a couple of mule deer the first morning but couldn't get a clear shot. They moved fast across a gully and vanished into the thicker brush. I spent the rest of the day still hunting, easing through the trees as quietly as I could. I saw scat, fresh tracks, and scrapes on the trees, but no solid movement. Still, I wasn't frustrated. Being out there alone was what I wanted. The silence, the lack of anything man-made for miles, it felt good. I'd always been more comfortable in the woods than around people. On the third morning, something felt a little off. I woke up to find the firewood I stacked the night before scattered. Not all of it, just the top half. A few pieces were several feet away from where I'd left them. I assumed a raccoon or porcupine had been poking around, maybe knocked them loose. Nothing else looked disturbed. I shook it off, made some instant coffee, and got moving. Around midday, I came across an old, rusted animal trap partially buried in the ground near a dry drainage ditch. It was broken, the jaw rusted open, but something about it unsettled me. It didn't look like something left by a modern hunter. It had that odd, forgotten feel to it, like it hadn't been touched in years but still held a kind of weight. I moved on and didn't give it too much thought after that. That evening, as I returned to camp just before sunset, I noticed boot prints on the edge of the trail. That stopped me cold. They were recent, less than a day old, and they weren't mine. I'd been hiking in waterproof hikers with a distinct tread. These were flatter, older looking, and seemed to go in a slightly different direction from the one I came from. I stood there for a long time, my heart thudding harder than it should have. I told myself it was probably a hunter I hadn't seen. That was possible. It wasn't posted land. Still, I hadn't heard any shots, dogs, or even the distant sound of an ATV. I slept light that night, my rifle next to me inside the tent. The wind picked up just after midnight, and the trees groaned above me. Every snapping branch outside made me freeze. I didn't hear anything human, but I stayed awake for hours, staring at the roof of the tent, heart beating in my ears. The next morning, I found something I didn't want to find. A rabbit carcass was lying about 10 feet from my tent. Its body had been skinned in a way that didn't look natural, not clean like a predator kill, and not quite like a hunter's cut either. It looked like someone had cut it halfway open and then just left it. The fur was still next to it in a loose pile. I stood there staring at it for several minutes before finally gathering my things. Something felt wrong. My whole body was buzzing. This wasn't right. I packed up some of my gear and took my rifle and pack with me for the day's hunt. But I had no intention of going far. I just wanted to get eyes on the area, maybe see if I could spot whoever else might be out there. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but it felt deliberate, like someone had wanted me to find that rabbit. The thought made my skin crawl. I stayed low that day, moving slower, watching the ground for more boot prints. Around mid-afternoon, I caught movement uphill. Not an animal. A figure partially obscured through the trees. I didn't get a clear look, but it was a man wearing dark clothing. He was standing still, not walking, and it looked like he was facing me. I dropped behind a deadfall and watched for a long time. When I looked again, he was gone. I circled back a different way, moving fast, heart pounding. I didn't go back to my camp right away. Instead, I watched it from about 100 yards back, hidden behind brush. Nothing moved around it, but I stayed there until sunset just in case. Eventually I slipped in, gathered the rest of my things, and packed up my tent. That night I didn't sleep. I hiked a mile further up the ridge and made a cold camp. No fire, no tent, just a tarp and sleeping bag. I buried the coals from my last fire before leaving and did my best to cover my tracks. I didn't want to be found. Every sound in the woods made me jump. I held my rifle across my chest the whole night. The next morning, I tried to move out. I aimed to take a longer loop back to my truck, trying to avoid the way I came in. But halfway through the hike, I found something that stopped me dead. There was another campsite, old but not ancient, with a fire ring, some bones scattered nearby, and what looked like a crude lean-to collapsed under fallen limbs. The weird part was the bones. They were clean, too clean, stacked in a small pile, and they looked small. Not deer, not elk, and not arranged like any hunter would. I didn't stay long. I marked the location mentally and moved fast. The forest started to feel different after that. Not louder, just heavier. The air was colder. I hiked harder, barely stopping to rest or eat. I had a constant feeling like I was being watched, though I never saw that figure again. I didn't stop until I hit the creek where I had parked, and by the time I reached my truck, it was nearly dark. My truck was untouched. I threw everything into the bed and drove the hell out of there. I didn't stop until I hit the highway almost 2 hours later. Only once I hit the lights of a gas station did I feel like I could breathe again. I never went back to that spot. I reported the bones and the strange camp to a local ranger station, and they sent someone to check it out. I never heard anything back. Maybe it was just an old trapper's camp. Maybe someone out there had been living off the land a little too long. But I know what I saw. I know the feeling of being watched isn't something I imagined. There wasn't any ghost, no monsters in the trees, just someone, a real living person who wasn't right, someone who didn't want me there, and they made sure I knew it. That rabbit, those bones, those boot prints, they weren't accidents. Sometimes the scariest thing in the woods isn't what's hiding in the dark. It's who, and they're real. It was late October 2013 when I decided to take a solo camping trip through Northumberland National Park in northern England. I was 29 years old, recently laid off from a warehouse job I'd held for nearly 5 years. The idea of being alone in the woods for a few days, away from the noise and pressure of everything back home in Sunderland, seemed like the kind of reset I needed. I packed light, just the essentials. A tent, sleeping bag, gas stove, food, water, flashlight, a map, and a small knife I kept for safety. My phone had limited signal in that area, which I expected, and I didn't plan on using it much anyway. I parked my car near the southern edge of the park, off a narrow B road, and started hiking northward. I had no exact destination in mind, just a plan to wander and camp where I felt like it. The weather was cold but dry, with gray skies hanging low over the thick forests and hills. By early evening that first day, I'd found a small clearing off the side of an old dirt trail. It was surrounded by thin, leafless birch trees and sat beside a small, silent stream. I pitched my tent there, cooked some instant noodles, and listened to the wind move through the trees while I ate. It was peaceful. I remember lying on my back that night, inside the tent, staring at the fabric above me. The wind made it ripple gently. My thoughts were calm, even though I was alone in a remote area with no phone signal. I've always felt more safe in nature than around people. I fell asleep sometime after 10 p.m. The second day went by without much happening. I hiked a few more miles north, cutting through forest and across some wide moorland. I didn't see another person all day. I set up my tent again near the edge of a large clearing where several fallen trees had rotted down into the moss. The woods beyond that clearing looked darker, thicker. There were birds, but not many. Everything around me seemed half asleep. That night, I heard a distant rustling sometime around midnight, but I wrote it off as a fox or badger. It was on the third day that things changed. I had kept walking north and ended up near a wooded ridge that sloped down into a hidden valley. The trees were thicker here, mainly pine, and the trail had long since disappeared. I only had my compass and map to follow, but I didn't mind. I liked being away from everything. That afternoon, I found another decent spot to pitch the tent, close to a rock outcropping with a bit of shelter from the wind. There were signs someone else had camped there recently. A few broken sticks arranged like a fire pit, some bits of foil, and even an old boot lying half-buried in the dirt. I checked the boot. It was dry inside and had clearly been there for a while. Still, it made me wonder who had been out there before me and when. That night, I stayed up later than usual. The air was colder, and the forest around me felt heavier. I sat just outside the tent in my coat, eating crackers and watching my breath curl into the dark. The forest beyond the fireless camp was pitch black. I had my flashlight, but I kept it off to save the battery. Everything was quiet except for the wind in the branches and the occasional creaking of trees. That's when I saw him. At first, it was just a shape, standing at the far end of the clearing, maybe 20 or 30 meters away. I thought it was a tree stump or a broken trunk, but the shape was tall, too tall and too narrow to be a stump. I stared at it for a long while. I didn't move, didn't even breathe much. Then the shape shifted, only slightly, but enough to make it clear that it was a man. A real person, just standing there, not walking, not looking for something, just standing. I squinted. He wasn't carrying anything. I could make out the outline of his head and shoulders. He seemed to be wearing dark clothes, maybe even a hood. I couldn't see his face at all. I stayed completely still. My food was on my lap, but I didn't move to pick it up. I felt my pulse climb into my ears. There was no reason for anyone to be out there that far from the road. No nearby cabins or car parks. No trail. Just me, my tent, and him. I waited like that for what felt like a full 10 minutes. He didn't move. Neither did I. Then I slowly reached behind me, into the tent, and grabbed my flashlight. I clicked it on, shining it directly at the spot where he stood. He was gone. There was nothing there. No man, no movement, not even a sound. My beam shook as I scanned the trees. I stood up and walked carefully to the edge of the clearing where he had been. Nothing. I even checked the ground for footprints but found none. I don't know how he could have left so quickly or silently, but I know what I saw. He had been there, watching me. I didn't sleep much that night. Every little sound kept me on edge. At some point around 3 a.m., I packed up the inside of my tent and left everything but the essentials zipped up inside. I sat outside with my flashlight in hand and waited for the first sign of dawn. As soon as the light started to return, I broke camp and began hiking back south. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just wanted to get closer to the road, to people, to anything. I didn't stop for breaks. My legs hurt by noon, but I didn't care. I only paused once, around mid-afternoon, when I came to a hill overlooking part of the forest I had passed through the day before. I turned around just to look. There was someone in the trees again, not standing at the edge, but half hidden, like they'd been watching from cover. The same height, the same dark figure. Again, not moving, just watching. I didn't wait long. I turned and kept walking. That night, I camped just a few kilometers from my car, near an old stone wall. I set up my tent with my back to the wall and lit a fire for the first time. I didn't care if it drew attention. I needed light. I barely slept, even though I was exhausted. I heard nothing, saw nothing, but I didn't feel alone. The next morning, I walked the last stretch back to the car. When I reached it, I found something that made my stomach turn. Sitting on the hood was the old boot I'd seen 3 days earlier at the ridge camp. Same boot, scuffed leather, broken lace, same size. I don't know how it got there. I hadn't taken it with me, and I'd left that camp long before dawn. But someone had carried it. Someone knew where I had parked. I didn't report it. I don't know what I would have said. There was no crime, no proof. Just a man standing in the woods, watching, following, and leaving something behind. Maybe it was a warning, or maybe it was nothing. But I haven't gone camping since. I haven't even left the city alone. Whatever his reason was for being out there, I don't think it was innocent. And I know he saw me, just like I saw him. I was 34 the summer I took a solo camping trip up in the Scottish Highlands, somewhere north of Ullapool, past the roads most tourists take. I'd taken time off work that August, this was back in 2018, and I needed space to think. Things in my life were loud, too many people needing too many things. I just wanted a few quiet days with my pack, some canned food, and the calm of empty hills. I had no signal up there. That was part of the appeal. I parked my car in a gravel pull-off next to a small forestry track that I'd found on a walking forum a few weeks earlier. It wasn't marked well, but the OS map showed it winding through pine woods and opening out to a small loch several miles in. I packed light, just a small green tent, sleeping bag, my stove, and some food. I had a handheld GPS, a compass, a printed map, and a knife. I'd done hikes like this before and felt comfortable on my own. I left my car around midday. The sun was out, and there were just enough clouds to keep the heat off. The trail was mostly dry, some muddy bits here and there, but nothing bad. It was quiet too. A few birds, some wind rustling the pine trees, but no people. No houses, no other cars on the way in. The deeper I walked, the more the path narrowed. Trees closed in around me, and after about 2 hours, I crossed a wooden footbridge that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The boards creaked under my weight, but they held. By late afternoon, I reached the loch. It was a dark, still body of water surrounded by reeds and low hills. Not a single man-made thing in sight. I set up my tent a little way back from the shore on a flat patch of mossy ground. I boiled some water, made instant noodles, and watched the sun start to fall behind the hills. There were midges, of course, there always are in the Highlands, but I had repellent and a head net. It wasn't perfect, but I could deal with it. That night I slept lightly. The ground was cold and uneven, and a few times I woke up to little noises outside the tent. Branches moving, wind catching the rainfly. Normal things. Still, I kept my knife nearby. It was just something I did when I camped alone. Nothing had ever happened, but the habit made me sleep easier. The next morning was cloudy and colder. I ate a protein bar and made coffee, then walked along the edge of the loch for a bit, trying to spot deer or anything interesting. I didn't see much, just a lot of old deer scat and a few empty snail shells. I came back to my tent around midday and noticed something that didn't sit right. There were boot prints, not mine. I was wearing heavy-soled hiking boots with a worn tread. These were newer prints, deep, clean, and different. I looked at them closely and counted 3 full steps, maybe 4, coming from the direction of the trees and stopping about 2 feet from my tent entrance. Then they turned and went back the way they came. No circling, no pacing, just in and out. That chilled me. It could have been someone out walking. Sure, but I hadn't seen a soul since I parked the car. No cars on the road, no signs of people along the trail. Whoever it was came all the way to my camp, stood outside my tent, and then left. And they didn't step inside my camp like they were saying hello. They came up while I wasn't there, then turned around and vanished. I checked my gear. Nothing was missing or touched. But now I started to second-guess everything. I kept replaying the walk I took that morning. I wasn't gone more than 45 minutes. Was someone watching me the whole time? Were they in the trees? I started noticing how quiet it was again. No birds, no insects, not even the wind. That afternoon I stayed near the tent. I didn't want to wander too far. I boiled water, cleaned out my cooking pot, and sat by the lock watching the water ripple with the breeze. But I was jumpy. Every small crack in the forest had me turning my head. I kept checking behind me. I zipped the tent closed even though I wasn't inside it, just to feel like things were more sealed off. When it got dark, I didn't light a fire. I didn't want anyone to see me from a distance. I ate cold beans straight from the tin and sat with my back against a tree for a long time, knife in my hand, listening. Around 10, I crawled inside my tent and zipped up the entrance and inner mesh. I didn't sleep. Not really. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I heard something. Footsteps. Not animal movement. Not wind. It was slow, heavy steps through wet grass and soft soil. I held my breath. The steps got closer. I could hear them crunch the pine needles near the base of my tent. They paused right outside. I didn't move. I was lying on my side. My knife clutched so tightly my hand hurt. The footsteps circled slowly, once, twice, and then stopped again near the entrance. I waited for something to happen, but nothing did. No rustle of the zipper, no sound of someone backing away. Just silence. Eventually, after what felt like an hour but was probably 5 minutes, I heard the footsteps again. Fainter this time, moving away. I stayed frozen for what felt like forever. When I finally sat up, it was starting to get light. Not full dawn, but the dark had faded to gray. I grabbed my gear, didn't bother with breakfast, and packed everything as fast as I could. As I rolled up my tent, I saw it, a set of boot prints in the damp moss. Same tread pattern as yesterday. They were fresh, so fresh the water still hadn't soaked back into the indents. They'd walked full circle around my tent and stopped right at the entrance again, just like the night before. But again, they didn't come in. No damage, no stolen gear. It was like someone just wanted me to know they were there. I left fast. I didn't even take the path back. I cut through the woods instead, using the GPS to angle myself roughly toward the trailhead. I scraped my arms on branches, tore my jacket on some wire fencing, and didn't stop until I saw the gravel pull off. My car was still there, untouched. I threw my gear in the back seat, locked the doors, and didn't slow down until I was back on the main road heading south. I didn't report it. I didn't see a crime. Nothing was taken. No one touched me, but it was real. I've camped since then, plenty of times, but never alone. Not again. Looking back, I know I made some mistakes. I didn't check in with anyone before I went. I didn't tell people exactly where I'd be. I assumed the wild meant safe, but it doesn't. The wild is just where people don't expect rules. Someone else was up there that week. I don't know who. I don't know why they didn't come into the tent. But I know they saw me, and they wanted me to know they saw me too.